The old man's coffee was already gone. The mug sat empty at the edge of the table, and he had not reached for the carafe, because the carafe was on the service counter and he would have had to ask. And he had learned, over many Tuesday mornings in the Pineview Diner in Colton, Wyoming, that asking for things from certain people in certain rooms was a cost he preferred not to pay. He sat with his hands folded and his VFW cap on the table beside the empty mug and his eyes on the window, which was how he sat every Tuesday. Which was how anyone who had been watching would have known that the posture was not contentment, but the specific, practiced endurance of a man who has decided that dignity requires a small amount of daily performance. The voice that broke the Tuesday morning quiet belonged to Brandon Holt. It was not a loud voice. It didn't need to be. It had 30 years of a certain kind of authority behind it, and it carried the way such voices carry, not by volume but by the expectation that the room would contract around it. "Still nursing the senior discount, Walt?" Brandon said. He was at the register, not looking at the old man. He said it the way people say things they have said before, without heat, as observation. 3 people at the counter heard it. None of them turned around. The old man at the window did not turn either. His jaw moved once, and then stilled, the way a man's jaw moves when he has decided not to say the thing that came first. He picked up his cap from the table and turned it in his hands. Slowly, he had been turning that cap in his hands in this diner for a long time. Then the door opened, and a German shepherd walked in ahead of his handler and stopped 4 feet inside the entrance and looked directly at the old man at the window. And the morning changed. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay all the way to the end. What that German shepherd noticed, and what the old man at the window had been carrying alone for 40 years, will change how you see the next stranger you pass without looking at. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, retired, was 41 years old and had the build of a man who had stopped training for performance and now trained because the discipline was one of the few things that organized his mornings reliably. He was 5'11" and 188 pounds, with close-cropped sandy hair going silver at the temples, and a face that people occasionally described as weathered, which he had come to accept as accurate in every sense of the word. The sun and the altitude and the 12 years had all contributed, and he had no complaint with the result. His jaw was wide, with a small scar along the left side near the hinge, from a piece of vehicle glass in Helmand Province in 2014 that had required 4 stitches in the field, and it healed clean, but it left its signature the way small things sometimes do when they happen at exactly the right angle to matter. His eyes were the pale, particular gray-blue of a Wyoming winter sky. Not cold, exactly, but carrying the quality of distance, the look of a man who is accustomed to assessing terrain from a long way off and has never quite recalibrated that habit for rooms. He was not unfriendly. He simply arrived at friendliness from a direction that took most people a moment to locate, which was the direction of earned trust rather than assumed warmth. And once located, it was both genuine and complete. He had served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps as a staff sergeant with the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. 3 deployments: Fallujah in 2009, Helmand Province in 2012 and 2014. He had come home from his final rotation with a Combat Action Ribbon, a Bronze Star for actions during a compound clearance in Marja that he did not discuss in social settings, a separated right shoulder that had been surgically repaired at Camp Lejeune and had tracked correctly ever since on every type of terrain except steep descents in cold weather, and a particular relationship with crowds that had taken 2 years of civilian life to understand and another 2 to manage. He was not afraid of crowds. He simply processed them differently than most people did, not as backgrounds, but as environments, reading them continuously in the way that had been trained into him and that had not. in 5 years of living in Colton, Wyoming, fully untrained itself. He had been doing structural inspection work for the county since 2019, which meant he spent most days outdoors in the clean, direct air of Carbon County, which was the right number of other people for him on most days. He had Shadow. Most days, that was the geometry he needed. Shadow was 8 years old and had arrived at the stage of a working dog's life where everything unnecessary has been shed and only the essential remains, worn smooth by use. His coat was a classic sable and black, the saddle deep and true, the tan at his chest and legs and face, carrying the warmth of old amber in good light, and he wore it with the authority of a dog who has stopped thinking about how he looks and attends only to what is present. He weighed 83 pounds. His left rear leg had the faint, permanent outward tracking of a healed muscle wound from a fragmentation round during a compound search in Helmand in 2013. Not Marcus's deployment, but the same province and the same year, which Marcus had discovered in the adoption paperwork and had eventually filed under things that do not require explanation to be true. His left ear carried a V-shaped notch from the same incident, healed silver. He moved with the unhurried focus that most humans achieve only in extremity, and that Shadow maintained as his ordinary state, settling into the partnership with Marcus in the first week with the quiet, total commitment of a dog who has identified the right person and is done looking. Colton, Wyoming sat in the High Plains Basin south of Rawlins, a town of 2,800 in the kind of country that demanded a certain quality of attention simply to inhabit. Wide and cold in the winters, bright and dry in the short summers, organized around the practical rather than the decorative, with the specific self-sufficiency of a place that has no patience for things that do not serve a purpose. The Pineview Diner on Main Street had been operating since 1971 and smelled on Tuesday mornings of coffee and pancake batter and the particular warmth of a propane heat source that did not quite reach the corner table by the east window, which was where Walter Pruitt sat every Tuesday, because the light was good, and because he could see the street, and because. In 52 years of Tuesday mornings at that table, no one had ever asked him to move. The diner's floors were cracked linoleum, green, faded to gray at the thresholds, and the counter stools were red vinyl, and the coffee was hot and strong, and cost $2.25, which was the senior price, which Brandon Holt knew and had just said aloud for the benefit of the room. Walter Pruitt was 81 years old. He wore a collared shirt and his VFW cap and the same brown cardigan he had worn every Tuesday for the past 4 winters, which was not because he lacked other clothing, but because he had identified a uniform that worked and saw no reason to revise it. He was not a tall man and had never been 5'7", lighter now than he had been in his working years, with the specific lightness of very old age that is not thinness but something else, a quality of diminished physical insistence, as though the body has begun the long negotiation with what it ultimately requires. His hands were mapped with the raised veins and sun-darkened skin of 81 years of Wyoming outdoor life, and they were still entirely steady. His eyes were a dark, clear brown that had not faded the way old eyes sometimes fade, but had instead deepened, the way dark water deepens rather than clarifies with age. He had been born in Colton and had expected to die in Colton, and had in the interval between those two events served his country in a way that the town of Colton, in the 58 years since his return, had never quite gotten around to formally acknowledging. He had served in the United States Army as a corporal with the 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. Korea, 1951 and 1952. The Imjin River, the Battle of the Hook, and the fighting along the Western Front and the final grinding months before the armistice. He had come home in August of 1953 with a Purple Heart for wounds received during a night assault on Hill 355 and a Silver Star, for actions during the same engagement in which he had, under direct fire and in the absence of his platoon leader, organized a fighting withdrawal that had saved the lives of 11 men in his element. The Silver Star was in a wooden box in the second drawer of his bedroom dresser, under a folded letter from the Department of the Army that he had read perhaps once in the past 30 years. He had not talked about Korea with anyone in Colton since the 1970s, when the last man who had served alongside him and come home to Carbon County had died of a heart attack at 56. He wore the VFW cap because he had earned it, and because it was a Tuesday, and because a man keeps certain things even when the world stops noticing what they mean. Brandon Holt was 47 years old and operated Holt Commercial Properties, which owned or managed 9 buildings in Colton, including the strip of storefronts on the east side of Main Street that contained, among other things, the space the Pineview Diner leased. His father, Gerald Holt, had built the original property portfolio over 30 years of development, and had passed the management to Brandon in 2015, along with the specific quality of authority that comes not from achievement, but from inheritance, and that is therefore not quite earned, and not quite not earned, and is consequently, in the people who hold it, the most difficult kind to check. Brandon was a regular presence at the Colton Chamber of Commerce and had been on the town council for 3 years, and was considered by most people who knew him to be a capable businessman, and by most people who knew him well to be a man who enjoyed, in small and deniable ways, the fact that his name was on the buildings, and theirs was not. He had never done anything that could be called cruelty. He had simply never done anything that could be called restraint either, and in 30 years of being Brandon Holt in Colton, Wyoming, he had developed the particular comfortable confidence of a man who has never once been made to feel the full weight of what he says before he says it. He said it every Tuesday. Small things, nothing prosecutable. The senior discount comment. A remark once about Walter's hearing aids. A question about whether the VFW still had enough members to hold a meeting, delivered with a smile that made it impossible to call a question. Walter Pruitt heard each one and turned his cap in his hands and looked out the window and said nothing. He had been saying nothing in this diner for 20 years. The people at the counter had been not turning around for 20 years. It was a Tuesday ritual, as fixed as the cracked linoleum and the propane heat, and the $2.25 coffee. Shadow stopped 4 feet inside the door and locked his attention on the corner table. Marcus read it immediately, not a threat signal, not hackles or low body, but the precise ears-forward posture Shadow used when he had identified a person who was carrying something alone that they should not be carrying alone. Marcus had seen this posture before. He knew what it meant. He walked to the counter, ordered 2 coffees, and carried both to the corner table by the east window. He said, "Mind if we sit down?" Walter Pruitt looked at the man standing at his table with 2 coffees and a German shepherd, and the particular expression of a man who has been asked few enough spontaneous questions in recent years that this one required a brief recalibration. He said, "Go ahead." Shadow did not sit. He stepped to Walter's side of the table and lay down with his chin on the old man's shoe. Slowly and entirely, like something being lowered into place. And Walter Pruitt looked down at the dog on his shoe, and something in his face moved. Not much. A fraction. The kind of movement that only happens when a person has been holding something in long enough that a small, unexpected warmth catches them off guard. Brandon Holt, at the register, watched this with the specific attentiveness of a man watching something he doesn't quite have a category for yet. Marcus set 1 coffee in front of Walter and the other in front of himself, and said nothing for a moment. which was not awkwardness, but the choice of a man who understood that the first thing said in a new conversation often determines whether the second thing gets said at all. Then he looked at the VFW cap on the table and said, "What branch?" "Army," Walter said. "Where?" A pause, not hesitation, but the weighing that happens when a question has not been asked in a very long time. "Korea," Walter said. "7th Cavalry." Marcus looked at him. "The 7th Cavalry." "The Imjin." "The Hook." He had a specific, detailed knowledge of those engagements from 12 years of professional study of small unit tactics. And he understood with complete clarity what the 7th Cavalry in 1951 and 1952 had actually done, and what it had cost, and what the men who came home from it had carried, in a country that had moved on before they had finished arriving. He said, "The Hook?" Walter looked at him, and for the first time that morning his eyes changed, not softening exactly, but opening, the way a door opens when someone knocks who knows the right door and not the one next to it. "Yes," Walter said. "The Hook." Brandon Holt pushed away from the register and walked toward the corner table. He carried the posture of a man approaching a situation he intends to define. He said, "Walt, you need anything over here?" The tone was the tone, proprietary, light, the implication of management dressed as consideration. Shadow raised his head from Walter's shoe. He did not growl. He simply raised his head and turned it toward Brandon Holt and looked at him with the amber gold, absolute stillness of an animal who has taken a full assessment and arrived at a conclusion. And Brandon Holt stopped walking as though he had encountered a physical obstacle, which in a meaningful sense he had. Marcus did not look up from his coffee. He said, "Without heat, we're good. Thanks." A long moment. Brandon Holt looked at the dog. Shadow looked at Brandon Holt. Nobody in the diner turned around, but the particular quality of the room's silence changed, from the silence of people not listening to the silence of people listening very carefully. Brandon said, "I just wanted to make sure, Walt, we're good," Marcus said again. Final, factual, no edge in it, which was the thing that made it final. Brandon Holt returned to the register. He picked up his coffee. He did not say anything else, and this was because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't require him to be something he was not, in a room that had just very quietly reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. Marcus said to Walter, "You mentioned the Hook. I've read the actions from that period, the withdrawal from Hill 355. Walter Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. Shadow had returned his chin to the old man's shoe. Outside the diner window, Main Street was gray and cold in the early morning, and the propane heater ticked in the corner, and somewhere on the service counter a carafe was full and hot, and nobody had thought to bring it to the corner table in 20 years. 11 men, Walter said. We got 11 men out. Marcus put his coffee mug down. He looked at Walter Pruitt, 81 years old, VFW cap on the table, brown cardigan, steady hands, 58 years of Tuesday mornings in a town that had never asked, and said, "Were you decorated for that?" Walter's jaw moved once, the way it had moved when Brandon Holt had said what he'd said. But this was different. This was the jaw of a man who has been asked the right question by the right person at the wrong time of life, and who is trying to decide whether to answer it in the abbreviated way that protects or the full way that costs. He said, "Silver Star." The diner was very quiet. In the corner by the propane heater, Martha Greer, 66 years old, white hair, apron, who had been working the Pineview breakfast shift since 1991 and who had poured Walter Pruitt's first Tuesday coffee in 1994. set her coffee pot down on the counter, and looked at the corner table and said nothing. She had known Walter's name for 30 years. She had not, until this moment, known what he had done with it. Marcus made 2 calls from the Pineview parking lot, while Shadow sat in the passenger seat and watched him through the windshield with the patient, total attention he brought to Marcus's phone calls when they mattered. The first call was to Colonel James Whitaker at Fort Carson, Colorado, whom Marcus had served under for 2 years of his 3rd deployment, and who had, in the interval since, become the kind of contact that a man like Marcus keeps, because the world occasionally produces a situation that requires a different weight of authority than he himself carries. Marcus told Whitaker about Walter Pruitt, the 7th Cavalry, Hill 355, the Silver Star, and 58 years of Tuesday mornings in a diner in Colton, Wyoming. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When did you say the VFWW chapter meets?" The second call was to the editor of the Carbon County Courier, a 53-year-old woman named Deb Strickland, who had been running the paper since 2004, and who had, in Marcus's experience from 2 prior county matters, the particular quality of a journalist who understands the difference between a story that gets clicks and a story that needs to be told. He gave her the same information. She said, "Can I come meet him?" "I'll ask him," Marcus said. He went back inside and asked Walter Pruitt if a reporter could come by the following week to talk about Korea. Walter turned his cap in his hands for a long moment and looked out at Main Street, and then he said, very quietly, "I always figured somebody would eventually." He had been waiting, it turned out, not with impatience, but with the particular endurance of a man who has concluded that the right thing sometimes takes a very long time to arrive, and that the correct response to that is not bitterness, but the discipline to still be present when it does. The Carbon County Courier ran Deb Strickland's story about Walter Pruitt on the front page the following Thursday. It ran 1,200 words, the full account of Hill 355, the fighting withdrawal, the 11 men, the Silver Star, with a photograph of Walter at the corner table, with Shadow's head resting on his forearm and his VFW cap on the table between them. Deb had called the Department of Veterans Affairs Records Office and had confirmed the citation language and had included it in full. The story was shared on the Colton Town Facebook page, and then by the Wyoming VFW State Commander, and then by a veterans advocacy account that had 200,000 followers, and then by several dozen accounts after that, until by the following Saturday, the Courier website had registered more traffic in 5 days than it had in the prior 6 months combined. Colonel Whitaker called Marcus on Friday. He said the 1st Cavalry Division Association had been in contact and would like to recognize Walter Pruitt formally at a ceremony in Colton in the spring, and would Marcus be willing to help coordinate. Marcus said he would. He called Walter on Saturday morning and told him. Walter Pruitt, 81 years old, alone in the house he had lived in since 1957, was quiet on the phone for long enough that Marcus said, "Walt?" "I'm here," Walter said. His voice was the voice of a man who is not crying because he has had a lifetime of practice not crying in front of people, extended now to phone calls, but who is in the full presence of something that has taken a long time to arrive and is trying to take it in at the right pace. "I'm here." Brandon Holt did not attend the ceremony in the spring. He had resigned from the Colton Town Council in January, following a Carbon County Courier follow-up story in which 3 additional Colton residents, including Martha Greer, who had worked the Pineview breakfast shift for 33 years, had described a pattern of public condescension toward Walter Pruitt specifically, and toward elderly and disabled Colton residents generally that had been ongoing for more than a decade. The Holt family attorney issued a statement. The statement was not well received. Brandon continued to manage Holt Commercial Properties. He had been conspicuously quieter at the Pineview counter since February, which was noticed by everyone who used the Tuesday morning diner and mentioned by none of them. Because some corrections are best acknowledged by simply proceeding as though they were always going to happen. The ceremony was held on the Colton Town Square on a Saturday in May, when the high plains were green and the sky was the specific blue that Wyoming produces in late spring as if to make up for what it does in January. Walter Pruitt stood at the front in his collared shirt and brown cardigan and his VFW cap and accepted the formal recognition of his Silver Star from a general officer of the 1st Cavalry Division who had driven from Fort Hood and who shook Walter's hand with both hands and held it for a long moment and did not let go quickly. The full citation was read aloud in the town square for the first time since 1953. 11 men named. The hill named. The night named. Walter stood and listened to it with the contained, careful stillness of a man hearing something read aloud that he has carried silently for so long that the sound of it in the open air is almost more than the body knows how to receive. Shadow sat beside Marcus at the edge of the square. His tail moved in the slow, full sweep of a dog who has assessed the situation completely and found it good. Marcus watched the old man at the front of the crowd and said nothing, which was the appropriate response to a thing that had taken 58 years to happen and needed no commentary from anyone who had simply been the coffee. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as the grand gestures we imagine when we pray for justice to find the people who deserve it. Sometimes they arrive as a second cup of coffee set down on a diner table by a man who noticed a dog noticing something, and then stayed to find out what. God does not always correct a 58-year silence in a single moment, but He places people in the right diner on the right Tuesday morning. And He puts a German shepherd in front of a door, and He asks of the person holding the leash only that they pay attention and act on what they see. Walter Pruitt earned his Silver Star in one night on a Korean hill in 1952. He waited 58 years to have it said aloud in the town where he was born. The waiting was not a failure. The arrival was not an accident. Some honors are simply delayed, and the men who carry them quietly across the decades are the truest proof we have that character does not require an audience to be real. If Walter's story touched your heart, share it today with someone who needs to be reminded that the quiet ones, the ones who don't ask to be seen, are often the ones carrying the most. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever known a veteran whose service was never properly honored, say their name in the comments. Let's give them the acknowledgement they were never given. If you believe in stories of courage, in dogs who see what we miss, and in the kind of justice that arrives slowly, but arrives, please subscribe so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you eyes today for the Walter Pruitts sitting at corner tables in every diner in this country, turning their caps in their hands, still waiting for someone to ask.